Okay. So for me, this paper starts kind of a few years ago. I was working in GIS. I had left academia as kind of an academic exile. And then through a series of kind of accidental serendipities, I found myself back in academia, but in an interdisciplinary department where there's a lot of flexibility for what counts as a publication. And so I had the thought of like, well, what if I can just write whatever the heck I want, like, and not have to worry about getting paid, what would it be? And so I immediately went to hand-drawn maps. This is one of the first ones I did just of my neighborhood in St. Paul. This was completed right before the pandemic, so I kind of associate this with everything falling apart, even though that's not what it's about. But it quickly morphed into doing graphic novel style mappings. This is one I presented in the map gallery last year at NACIS, unhelpfully last year, not this year, or part of it. And this, when I would show these things to people, a common question that would come up is, why? Which I think is a fair question. So, obviously this could be much more efficiently done doing something like Esri story maps, or I have kind of amateur skills at web design, hacking together a web page could be much more efficient than drawing everything by hand. And the initial reason was just experiential one. Heather Smith wrote a great short little article in Cartographic Perspectives a year or two ago on kind of just the delight and pleasure out of doing maps by hand. And so that was initially kind of the entire reason of it. She mentions in that article that, like in this case, this started out like I did the traditional GIS stuff of taking a DEM and extrapolating contour lines out of it. But then I redrew it all by hand on pen and paper. And there's just a different level of understanding you get of the landscape by actually drawing each individual contour line that you don't get when it's automated for you. So there was that, but then as I started doing this more, it reminded me of a basic obsession I've had since I was a kid of like, how do we know what we know? I've never lost that little kid instinct of like always asking why. And so thinking about the ways that hand-drawn maps can be an avenue for signaling our own limitations. So for what I want to talk about in this presentation, which I was realizing as as I was listening to these other really good and intimidatingly good presentations before me, I realized what I really have is more of a series of questions than an argument that I've got together, but that's okay. I think that maybe hopefully fits kind of the point of it. So one is, and these are, I guess also to be honest, these are more begging the question than honest questions because, I'm wrapping this back around to hand-drawn maps. But so what kind of design choices can we make that will unmask the cartographer? Thinking of kind of questions coming from concerns about decolonization, feminist studies, about power and cartography, things that other people have written about much more evocatively than I could. So what kinds of design choices can we make that unmask the cartographer and can situate the map of a product of an actual living person? At the same time, being aware that map design is often, as we all know, about omission. It's about not including things. And so how do we reinsert information or imply something without overburdening the map user? Generally, I assume a map user, or audience isn't concerned about who made the map. They're just wanting to know about the geography of the map. Or to riff, my PhD was in sociology, and then I went to GIS later in life. Within standpoint theory, which comes out of feminist sociology, so folks like Dorothy Smith and Sandra Hardin, Patricia Hill Collins, how can we design maps that signal they come from a standpoint? So not necessarily like your particular standpoint. So I'm not thinking here about like elucidating your own kind of demographic categories, although there's nothing wrong with that, but simply to imply that this map does have a standpoint. It's not objective, or it's not fully objective. So this is similar to, or maybe in like a partial limited answer to this call from Megan Kelly and Amber Boss in an article last year about the need to press pause on traditional workflows and incorporate feminist considerations and representations of power and position. Obviously, I'm not saying just draw it by hand, that's the solution, but maybe it gives a partial kind of interjection into there, into compromising the power of the cartographer. Or to riff on the well-known book by Mark Momenier, If All Maps Lie, How Can We Communicate That We're All Liars? Or a little less pointedly, how can we communicate that a human made this? Okay, so 2 analogies, hopefully helpful. The first one comes from a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu. So Bourdieu, maybe my favorite sociologist if I had to come up with one, really dense, almost incomprehensible language. So I'm not going to go into any of his concepts because what I want to talk about is his language. So he's really known among sociologists, at least, or the sociologists I know, is like this obnoxiously difficult person to read. And when I used to write in that field, he was the kind of person that if you quote, it's like putting a roadblock in your text because, you're trying to write clearly and then you've got this dense, like, what the heck is that guy saying kind of thing. So as an example, this is one of his key ideas is the idea of habitus. I won't explain it in English. This is how he said it, at least translated from the French. Systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, as principles of the generation and structuring of practices and representations which can be objectively regulated and regular without in any way being the product of obedience to rules, and so on. And I should say, you don't have to, you can open any page in Bourdieu and it reads like this. So obviously this is a little bit funny, and one could, poke at like the academic hubris of this or academic posturing, and he would actually invite you to do that. He's very into kind of critical, reflexive sociology. But what Bourdieu was doing in terms of the rhetoric of this is, this comes from a book of responding to ethnographic work he did with the Kabyle people in Algeria, and he was wanting to signal to his reader that he was creating a model, that any kind of sociological theory isn't reality, it's a model. And so the actual, even though he was talking about the actual lived experience of the Kabyle people in Algeria, this wasn't that experience. This was a model trying to make sense of it. There's a distance between sociological writing and life, right? And so what I'm thinking is, how can our maps communicate the same kind of epistemological move, so that is signifying that the map's a model of the world and not the world itself, or to use the old phrase in a non-metaphorical way, that it's a map and not the territory, while, unlike Bourdieu, remaining legible and accessible to our audience. So an example of something that maybe does both is the comic journalism of Joe Sacco. And I only have the cover for anxieties about copyright issues, but I brought the book with me if anybody wants to look at it afterwards. So this is a book about the Bosnian War in the 1990s, and he's a journalist, and so it's a work of serious journalism about kind of the lived experience of people who lived for about 2 years in Gorazda, which was, or still is, a city in Bosnia that was at that time during the war almost entirely Bosnians, so Bosnian Muslims, surrounded by Serb-controlled territory and completely cut off from the rest of the world during the war. And so in the book, what he's doing graphically as he's telling the stories of these people is interspersing the stories which he draws with like pictures of people at parties, pictures of him interviewing, or drawings of him interviewing people going about their everyday lives, the kind of things you would think about, things you would see in a graphic novel, with kind of perspectival drawings like the one you see here, which was kind of from an angle that's not really actual human experience unless you have the ability to levitate, and this was drawn before drones were really a thing, as well as a few maps, so kind of in a more apparently objective kind of God's eye view of the landscape mixed in with these pictures of people, thank you, And he includes himself then in the images with the people. So in other words, you've got like a scene at a party, and then the quote I'm about to show you, there's a scene, on one page you have a scene like this, so kind of like a godlike perspective. On the next page you have a scene of him with other people at a party. And a comic scholar writes, as that's Joe Sacco, focuses the reader using comics and alternative autobiographical techniques transplanted to his role as a journalist, Sacco requires his audience to confront the fallacy of nonfiction impartiality by demonstrating the limitations of his own objectivity and representation. So Sacco reinserts his visible persona absent in the prior scene, reminding the audiences of his book's subjectivity. And he's doing this just simply visually. It's not something he's telling the audience he's doing. It's just kind of implied by the presence of him drawn into the narrative. Okay, so back to maps and hand-drawn maps. The essential argument that I'm going for is that this is an underutilized tool, kind of a tool in our toolbox, like things like perhaps participatory mapping or some kinds of interactive maps that we can use to undermine essentially, maybe not undermine, well maybe sometimes undermine the idea of the cartographer as an authority or as the map as an objective depiction of reality. To clue off to the reader, in other words, to be critical of the map that they're looking at. I think it also points to that hand-drawn maps, I'm all for aesthetics. I like beautiful things. I think a lot of you are into maps and map designs because you like pretty things, right, in part. And I like maps that incorporate art or art that incorporates maps or maps that are art. So this is not a diss on any of that at all, but hand-drawn or handcrafted maps can also do some of the work at times in some contexts of a more traditional non-artistic map, so to speak. Yeah, so that's another piece. And then finally, as I think I've made clear, hopefully, these maps that can be a way to bracket yourself while ironically also kind of putting yourself into the story a little bit as a way to imply a non-universal claim. So I picked this image because it was the kind of map that you could easily imagine. It's just a map of an airplane ride. You could easily imagine like you could do this in Esri Story Maps or on Google Maps or something like that. But by putting it by hand drawing it, I was kind of, hopefully partially asserting that well, in this case it was from a memoirish kind of short story, but this is something that a human created. So in other words, they can both communicate geographic knowledge, they can do the work that we typically expect maps to do in a textbook or a journal article, a magazine, newspaper article, but also invite the reader to recognize that the map is situated and the map was made by a human. 1 out of 8 billion. Okay, that's it. Thank you.